thank you very much, and thanks for inviting me. I'm guessing that most of you probably know a couple of things about the Churchill Archives Centre already. Hopefully you know that we have the personal papers of Sir Winston Churchill, and I suspect you may also know that we have the papers of Margaret Thatcher. And of course we have a couple of iconic artefacts as well. We have a genuine unsmoked Churchill cigar and an equally genuine prime ministerial handbag. But most of what we have over in the Archive Centre is, of course, archival material, it's paper material, it's photographic material, and there is an immense amount of it. So the Churchill Papers alone, the personal papers and writings of Sir Winston Churchill, are 2,500 boxes, about 1 million items. Everything from his childhood letters and his school reports through to his final writings. His correspondence with friends and family, alongside correspondence with presidents and kings and generals, and alongside his literary material and alongside his notes for those famous speeches and broadcasts. But then around the papers of Sir Winston Churchill are now gathered and assembled a further 664 collections. The papers of prominent politicians, diplomats, military leaders and scientists of the Churchill era and beyond. So you can see that I've set myself a rather huge task for this evening, because I'm meant to cover in the next 30 minutes not only the life of Winston Churchill, about which of course an enormous amount has been written, not least by Churchill himself, but also to tell you something about what we as an archive centre do with all of this material. So obviously this is going to be really snapshots, facets, aspects of the life of Churchill, and also aspects of the work of the Churchill Archives Centre. So I'll start with what you know or what you've seen. This, of course, is the portrait of Churchill that hangs in the main dining room. It's actually a copy. The original portrait is by Sir William Orpen. This is a specially commissioned copy by the artist John Lee Pemberton, which was done at Clementine Churchill's request, Churchill's widow's request, to hang specifically in that hall. What I think is interesting about it is that it doesn't show the bulldog war leader, the Churchill that you all know from the Second World War. It shows the much younger man. It shows Winston Churchill aged about 40 in 1915, just after he'd suffered his first major political setback. He'd just been sacked by Asquith as First Lord of the Admiralty during the First World War. First Lord of the Admiralty, the minister who is in charge of the British Navy. And that's perhaps why there are such big bags under his eyes, and perhaps why you've got this incredibly dark background. But of course the reason that Clementine Churchill liked this picture is that it shows the younger man. It shows the man that she married. But it makes a point, I think, that Churchill already by the time of the First World War was a major figure on the national, if not the international stage. By this time, by the time he was 40, he'd already served as President of the Board of Trade, as Home Secretary, and now as First Lord of the Admiralty. And his career really is a roller coaster of a career. Of course, this is how it all starts. This is Churchill, the schoolboy. And in the Archive Centre, we have his reports from his first school, St George's School in Ascot, where he was between the ages of 7 and 9. And of course, what they show, famously, is that he was far from being a model school pupil. So if you look here, you can see under diligence, you've got conduct has been exceedingly bad. He's not to be trusted to do any one thing. And then at the bottom, you've got under headmaster's remarks, very bad, is a constant trouble to everybody and is always in some scrape or other. He cannot be trusted to behave himself anywhere. Now, what I think is interesting about these school reports is when you look at them closely, you can see that actually it's Churchill's behaviour, it's his conduct that's being criticised. And the teachers have to sort of grudgingly admit that notwithstanding he has made decided progress. And at the bottom, the headmaster has to admit that he has very good abilities. The thing is, he's not using them. And he famously admitted in his autobiography of his early life, written in about 1930, that where his imagination, interest or reason were not engaged, he would not or he could not learn. And I think that's what you see here. You're seeing a very stubborn, willful, rebellious child who was determined not to fall in with the ways of the strict Victorian boarding school. And in the end, his parents have to remove him from this school because his physical health is suffering because he's actually being caned so much. The headmaster at this particular school, this man down here, Snake Kinnersley, was particularly barbaric, and he would cane the children until they bled. And I think what you're seeing here in sort of Churchill the child is perhaps the genesis, the origin of the sort of stubborn, willful politician and prime minister and war leader that you get later on. So that's my sort of first facet of Churchill. My second is Churchill the soldier, Churchill the officer. He wasn't considered bright enough to go to university, so that wasn't an option for him, and his father decided that he was going to go into the army. Even then, it took him 3 attempts to get accepted to officer training at Sandhurst, and he gets admitted to the cavalry, not the infantry, and that was considered sort of second best at that point. But of course, he comes from a very privileged background. His father, Lord Randolph Churchill, was a son of the Duke of Marlborough, so Winston is a grandson of the Duke of Marlborough, and has himself been a very prominent Conservative politician, throwing his career away with a very impetuous resignation. And his mother, Lady Randolph Churchill, born Jenny Jerome in Brooklyn, New York, was famed as a high society hostess and networker. So he comes from that very privileged aristocratic background. That gets him into the army, it gets him into the cavalry. But then his father dies in 1895 when Churchill is only 20 years old, and he suddenly finds himself as the sort of the head of the household, and he suddenly finds himself having to make a name for himself and having to prove himself to his father's memory. And that's something that comes through in a lot of his early letters and early writings, that was something he felt he had to do, and that he had to pick up his father's mantle. So he's in the army, he plays polo, he's a very accomplished polo player. His team actually wins the interregimental trophy in India. But unlike his fellow officers, he's not prepared just to sit back and enjoy officer life in the empire. He decides quite early on that he does want to go into politics. So he gets his mother to start sending him books. Having not been to university, he's determined at this stage in his life to try and educate himself and to fill in what he sees as the gaps in his own learning. So he's very much sort of self-taught at this stage. But his real strategy is to get himself transferred to as many dangerous spots as possible, to get himself shot at, and then to write them up as newspaper articles and books. What he's looking for in this period of his life, between the ages of 20 and 25, 1895 to 1900, is he is quite deliberately going out and looking for fame and fortune. So he goes to Cuba, where he accompanies the Spanish forces there who are putting down a Cuban insurrection, and he comes under fire for the first time around the time of his 21st birthday. He gets himself transferred to the Indian northwest frontier with the Malakand Field Force, where he's fighting in some of the same valleys that are being fought over in Pakistan and Afghanistan today. A region remains incredibly volatile. And he charges with the 21st Lancers at the Battle of Omdurman in the Sudan against the dervishes in 1898. And he writes these things up as newspaper articles, which of course was hugely frowned upon. Serving British officer, it's not something that they should be doing. But the problem with the newspaper articles is that he can't put his own name to them. They're all from our special correspondent, from our war correspondent, and so on. So he doesn't stop there. He then turns his newspaper articles into books. And so he writes a history of the Malakand Field Force. He writes a history of the River War, about the campaign in the Sudan. And he's doing that deliberately to raise money and to earn an income, but also to underpin the advancement of his own political career with his own writings. And that's a trick that he uses throughout his life and career. He funds his political career through his writing, but he also uses his writing to raise his profile. And this he does most effectively at the time of the Boer War. Time of the Boer War, he leaves the army, tries to get elected for Parliament for the first time for the northern constituency of Oldham, fails. And then he's thinking, well, what do I do? The Morning Post pay him £250 a month, which at that time was an enormous amount of money, to go out as their war correspondent to cover the Boer War. He goes out and he is on an armoured train which is going up to the front line, which gets ambushed. He actually plays a role in trying to prevent the ambush, which of course, as a correspondent, he shouldn't have done. The Boers, on capturing him, could have executed him for that. They don't. They capture him, they imprison him, and then of course he famously escapes from prison. He jumps over the prison wall, he jumps onto a passing train, he gets hidden in a mine for several days, and then makes his way to Lourenço Marques in Portuguese territory. And of course the first thing that he does is to write all of this up himself as a newspaper article. And it turns him into the equivalent of an international celebrity today. That's covered by not just the British papers, but the American papers. So it makes him incredibly famous. And he uses that to get into Parliament for the first time in 1900. So he's not your sort of usual standard late Victorian, Edwardian political figure. He's someone who very much makes his own luck. This is how one of the contemporary papers covers Churchill's heroic role in the defence of the train. So it's showing him as a sort of Dan Dare-like figure. And of course, he uses this to stage lecture tour both of the United Kingdom and of the United States and Canada, and then turns it into 2 books. So he's very good at self-publicity, self-advancement. And that remains the case all the way through his career. His career is underpinned by writing. He writes a multi-volume history of the First World War, he writes a multi-volume history of the Second World War, multi-volume history of the English-speaking peoples. He writes a biography of his ancestor, the first Duke of Marlborough. He writes a biography of his father, Lord Randolph Churchill. So this is he has 2 professions. It's a political career, but one that's underpinned by writing. And of course, that's one of the things that makes the archive so strong. But he is also, from the beginning, a very controversial political figure. First of all, he changes party, not once but twice. So he enters the House of Commons as a Conservative. In 1904, he famously crosses the floor and joins the Liberals. And then 20 years later, he crosses back and rejoins the Conservatives. And he times those crossings very well. He crosses to the Liberal Party just as they have a landslide election victory, allowing him to then rise up through the ranks of Asquith's government. And he moves back to the Conservatives just in time to be made Chancellor of the Exchequer by Baldwin in the 1920s. And all of this allowed him to famously remark, anyone can rat, but it takes a certain ingenuity to re-rat. But it is a very controversial career. He's on the wrong side of the female suffrage question. He doesn't come out in support of female suffrage, and as a result his meetings are targeted by the suffragettes, and he's actually attacked by a suffragette wielding a dog whip, famously on Bristol Mead's Temple Station. He is a lifelong imperialist, famously of course describing Gandhi as a half-naked fakir, and from 1917 onwards he is a great opponent of communism. So that he does actually go out and see Mussolini in 1929, I think, and initially says some quite positive things about Mussolini as being a potential bulwark against communism in Europe. I think, to his credit, that's something that he abandons quite quickly, and he is certainly one of the first leading political figures in this country to identify the threat to European stability and order, and to the German domestic political situation posed by the rise of Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party, and he speaks out very vocally against that from the beginning. But you can see that this is a very up and down career, and the amazing thing really is that I think, or one of his great character traits, is his resilience and his ability to come back from all of these apparent setbacks. And that again takes us back to his writing, because part of the way he does this is through using his writing to come back from political defeat. And not just political defeat, but also sort of physical disadvantage. He goes to New York in 1931, and he's actually on Fifth Avenue, and he makes the classic British mistake of looking the wrong way and then gets hit by a car coming the other way. Very seriously injured. He's hospitalised, then released into the care of his family in the Waldorf Astoria Hotel. He has to cancel, or at least delay, the lecture tour that he'd embarked on. So what his response, I think, is a good example of this Churchillian resilience, because what he does is to write up a couple of newspaper articles on what it was like to be hit by a motor car, and I was conscious through it all, and he recovers the money that he's lost through cancelling the lectures that way. Not only does he do that, but he does this, and this is one of my favourite documents, Churchill documents from within the archives. He summons this New York doctor, Otto Pickart, to his bedside, and you can almost hear Churchill dictating this prescription to him, which reads, "This is to certify that the post-accident convalescence of the Honourable Winston S. Churchill necessitates the use of alcoholic spirits, especially at meal times. The quantity is naturally indefinite, but the minimum requirements would be 250 cubic centimetres." And you can see that he's written in the corner here, "keep on hand." And of course the reason he needs to keep that on hand is that this is New York in 1932, this is Prohibition. And this is Churchill's way of circumventing the whole Prohibition regulations. So Churchill finally becomes Prime Minister, of course, in May 1940, which is something that he's been aspiring to all the way through his career. The interesting thing, of course, is he's not elected Prime Minister at that point. He becomes Prime Minister because there is a political crisis, and the House of Commons loses support in Neville Chamberlain and Neville Chamberlain's leadership. And it's quite clear that a national government of all parties, all political parties, is going to have to be formed. And the only leading Conservative that the Labour Party and the Liberal Party will rally around and serve under, really, is Winston Churchill. And the reason they do that, of course, is that they see him as someone who has been campaigning against Nazi Germany since the beginning of the 1930s, has a lot of support by this point in the public, who since the failure of the Munich Agreement have been slowly sort of moving behind Churchill and his point of view. He has a lot of support in the press by this point, and he is seen as a vigorous war leader, or someone who will conduct the war vigorously in a way that Chamberlain won't. But he isn't the natural choice of his own party, the Conservative Party. The majority of the Conservatives would have favoured Lord Halifax, the Foreign Secretary, rather than Churchill. And of course, had Halifax become Prime Minister, there's a very high chance that we would have had some form of negotiated settlement with Hitler, because that's something that Halifax then pushed for as Foreign Secretary under Churchill in key debates in the War Cabinet in May 1940. And some of those debates form the crux of this new movie, Darkest Hour, with Gary Oldman playing Churchill. So those of you who go to see that will see some of that. So he becomes Prime Minister in May 1940, but it's Prime Minister of a coalition government, and his position is initially very weak. He doesn't really have the backing of his own party. The Labour Party leaders are still very sort of mistrustful of him, and he becomes Prime Minister on the 10th of May 1940, which is the day that Hitler launches his Blitzkrieg offensive against France and the Low Countries. And we forget now that the first 5 weeks of Churchill's premiership are marked by nothing but huge military defeat. When he became Prime Minister, the last thing he expected was that our main ally, France, would fall so quickly and so completely to Germany, and that our army there, the British Expeditionary Force, would be defeated and have to be evacuated from the beaches of Dunkirk, and that within weeks we would be facing the prospect of direct air attack from the continent and even possible invasion. So things were pretty bad. On the 26th of May, he actually gets a report from his chiefs of staff, which is absolutely critical, which says that, well, we can fight on without our army, but only if our air superiority holds. And if our air superiority doesn't hold, and if our aircraft factories are bombed, and if civilian morale doesn't hold, then we may have to concede defeat. But based on that report from his chiefs of staff, he wins a debate within his own war cabinet against Halifax to actually resist mediation and to fight on. And of course, he embarks on his role as war leader in trying to rally the nation. His style of leadership is very distinctively Churchillian. It is leadership from the front. It's trying to inject dynamism into the Whitehall establishment. So he favours the use of these sort of prime ministerial memos with these action this day stickers that he would attach to them and that he would send out to his chiefs of staff and his generals. He's very active, of course, and very highly visible in going out and inspecting the bomb damage. And he deliberately, I think, makes himself a very visible presence and a very distinctive presence, with his use of sort of eccentric clothing and hats, his V for Victory salute, his omnipresent cigar. He's turning himself into a sort of symbol of war leadership, and that's an important element of his premiership, I think. And there's no doubting his own personal bravery. He could get rather carried away with this at times. We have this wonderful correspondence in the archive about Churchill actually wanting to go to the beaches on D-Day itself. He actually gets Admiral Ramsay to prepare a plan that would have seen the Prime Minister actually landed on the beaches on D-Day. And of course that's the last thing that Eisenhower or any of the commanders want. The last thing they want is the added burden of trying to look after the Prime Minister, or the Prime Minister trying to interfere in military operations. But the only person constitutionally who could order Churchill not to go was the King. And so you get this wonderful handwritten letter from King George VI on Buckingham Palace paper, May the 31st, 1944. My dear Winston, I've been thinking a great deal of our conversation yesterday, and I've come to the conclusion that it would not be right for either you or I to be where we planned to be on D-Day, because Churchill had been trying to persuade the King to go with him. I don't think I need emphasise what it would mean to me personally and to the whole Allied cause if at this juncture a chance bomb, torpedo or even a mine should remove you from the scene. So the King's trying to talk Churchill down. Doesn't work straight away, and in fact there has to be a second letter from the King to Churchill on June the 2nd before he finally gives in and agrees that he can't go. So there's no doubting his sort of personal bravery, and it is very much leadership from the front. But again, it's also leadership that's underpinned by words, and of course by his famous wartime broadcasts. And we have in the archives his notes for his famous speeches. And I think they're particularly interesting because they show how he worked. So this is the penultimate page from the Finest Hour speech of the 18th of June 1940. Now France basically concludes an armistice on the 17th of June. So this is Churchill's response to that. He can't have started this speech really before the 17th of June. So he's doing it on the 17th, the 18th of June, with a political crisis raging around him. And yet he devotes time to producing these words, and then delivers this speech in the House of Commons and broadcasts it to the nation over the BBC. And the way he would work is that he would dictate. He would have a duty secretary with what was then a state-of-the-art silent typewriter to set down his words. The words would be set down first of all in normal typescript, and he would go through making annotations and corrections and alterations, and sometimes you can see that he's been through several times. When the speech is more or less in its final format, it's taken away by the duty secretary, it's typed up at A5 size so that it fits comfortably into his hand or comfortably into his pocket. It's actually what he called clopped together, which means that it's held together by treasury tags so that the pages can't get mixed up and he can't lose his place. And then it's set out on the page like this, in this blank verse format that he called speech form. Others called it psalm form because it looks a bit like the book of Psalms. And of course the advantage for him of having it all set out like this is that it gives him the emphasis, it gives him the pauses, it gives him the rhythm. It also shows, I think, how thoroughly he prepared. Because although he was a great orator, I would argue that he's really first and foremost a great writer. He's not maybe a natural orator in the same way as Lloyd George or his friend Lord Birkenhead. He is someone who actually prepares incredibly carefully beforehand, and that's actually true all the way through his life. And you can see that this speech is being reworked right up to delivery. So at the end here you've got what General Weygand calls the Battle of France is over, the Battle of Britain is about to begin, and in his Churchillian red pen he's added, all shall be restored. And then you go through into the final page, upon this battle depends the survival of Christian civilization, building up to this sort of Shakespearean ending. Let us therefore brace ourselves to our duty and so bear ourselves that if British Empire and Commonwealth lasts for 1,000 years, men will still say this was their finest hour. And of course, he wasn't content with just producing the speeches at the time. He was also very clever, I think, in keeping his archive and using his archive to rework events after the war, to write his own account, his own history of the Second World War, and to get that out as quickly as possible so that he publishes it between 1947 and 1954 in 6 volumes. And this, of course, is the man who famously said in Parliament, "I think it will be best for all parties to leave the past to history, especially as I propose to write that history myself." And of course that's what he did. So it's all about not only sort of managing the events themselves at the time and producing the right words for the moment, but it's also then about how you reinterpret those events for subsequent generations. One of the sort of less well-known facets of Churchill's life is that he had a lifelong interest in science. He wasn't a scientist by any means, but this is someone who learnt to fly in 1912 when it was an incredibly dangerous thing to do. You're only 10 years away from the Wright brothers at this point. During both World Wars, he's very interested in the latest scientific and technological developments and how these might be used. He plays a role in sponsoring the development of the tank in the First World War. And of course, at the end of his life, it's this fear that this country might be falling behind in terms of science and technology that leads him to come here and found this college. And that tree there is that oak tree just out there in front of the Jock Colville Hall, planted on the 17th of October 1959, Churchill's one visit to this site. He comes here, he plants that oak tree, he plants a mulberry, which is the mulberry next to the Porter's Lodge, and he gives what's one of his last public speeches, setting out his vision for the college that's going to bear his name. And of course that vision is that it should in particular train scientists and technologists and engineers, but not exclusively. And I think the way he would have seen it is that he would always wanted those scientists exposed to the civilising virtues of the arts. But of course that's what leads to Churchill College, and it's the foundation of the college that then leads to the Archives Centre being built. So the college, as I'm sure you all know, built between 1960-64, National and Commonwealth Memorial to Sir Winston Churchill. But from the beginning, the college starts to collect books, it starts to collect documents and artefacts and items relating to Churchill, and there's a hope that Churchill's papers will come here and form the centrepiece of an archival collection. While he's alive, his papers are with him. When he dies, they pass to his son Randolph, who's charged with writing the biography of his father. In fact, he only gets to volume 2 before dying in 1968. It's then taken on by Martin Gilbert, who produces another 6 volumes, making it one of the largest official biographies ever written. But it's after Churchill's death, after Randolph's death, that the question's asked seriously, what's going to happen to all of this material? And thankfully for us, Clementine Churchill was firmly of the view that it should come to Churchill College. So it's at that point that the college builds a dedicated archive centre. And for those of you who've been in the Jock Colville Hall, of course you'll have seen the names on the far wall. And the archive centre is built with money from a number of well-known American philanthropists and particularly former American ambassadors to this country, so that it's built on the model of an American presidential library. So we are really, the closest thing to an American presidential library in this country. And I like to joke, particularly in front of American groups, that we're now, of course, the equivalent of 4 American presidential libraries, in that we also have Margaret Thatcher's papers, we have John Major's papers, although they're still being catalogued and opened, and Gordon Brown has promised his archive, and that's about to come in. But the Archive Centre is much, much more than that. As I said at the beginning, 664 collections, politicians across the political spectrum. It's everyone from Winston Churchill and Ernest Bevin to Margaret Thatcher and Neil Kinnock, via people like Fenner Brockway on the left of the Labour Party, right across to Enoch Powell. So it's all shades of political opinion in this country, but it's also some of the key civil servants, it's some of the key diplomats and ambassadors. We have the papers of a number of military leaders. So we have the papers of Field Marshal Lord Slim, who commanded British armies in Burma in the Second World War, Admiral Ramsay, who did the Dunkirk evacuation and the naval aspect of the D-Day landings. We have the papers of Admiral Fisher, whose resignation over the Dardanelles actually brought Churchill down in 1915. And we have the papers of scientists. Because Churchill founded this college to train scientists and technologists, and because many of his wartime scientists were actually involved in setting up this college, some of them, of course, appear in these rather establishment portraits on the wall here. But Sir John Cockcroft, nuclear physicist, Nobel Prize-winning nuclear physicist, first master of this college. We have his papers. We have the papers of Chadwick, who discovered the neutron. We have the papers of Frank Whittle, the pioneer of the jet engine, and of Rosalind Franklin, including her notebooks from 51 to 53, showing all of her pioneering research into DNA. So the real value of the Archive Centre is the whole range of material that's been brought together under one roof. So that you can look at this integrated body of material and you can study recent British history and policy and strategy from a number of different but complementary perspectives. It is mainly documents, but of course there are all sorts of wonderful artistic things within the papers. Back in the Victorian era, naval officers were trained in painting and drawing because it was felt to help them with their cartographic skills. And in the journals of young midshipman John de Robeck, we have this incredible series of watercolours of the places that his ship, HMS Shannon, was visiting as it sort of sailed around the Empire. He was obviously destined for great things, and he goes on to become an admiral. In terms of our scientific papers, I think this is one of the most significant documents that we have in the archive. It's a calculation, just on this one page, that John Cockcroft is asked to do by Lord Rutherford, and he's asked to work out the probability of artificially disintegrating atoms by protons based on Gamov's theory. And he comes up with this calculation, which proves that it's possible. On the basis of this calculation, Rutherford lets Cockcroft and Walton do the work that ultimately leads to the systematic disintegration of atoms, and that, of course, leads to atomic power. It leads to atomic weapons. It leads to a whole fields of research, and there are several of you here that will know far more than me about all of the things that come out of this one piece of mathematics. This is the original case for the jet engine. This is Whittle's very first paper for the case for a gas turbine engine from 1931 or 1932, which of course famously wasn't initially taken seriously by the Royal Air Force. And this is just one page from Rosalind Franklin's notebook from 1953, showing some of her sort of early drawings on the double helical nature and structure of DNA. And of course the Archive Centre is still collecting material. We're the Churchill era and beyond, so we don't collect anything before Winston Churchill. Equally, we haven't said where and beyond will take us. So at the moment we're still taking in material, we're still opening material. At the moment, Margaret Thatcher's papers, we're opening another year each year. So we've just opened her papers for 1987. Next year we're planning to open 1988, 1989, and then it will roll on opening John Major's papers. So there's always new material coming in, there's always new material being opened up. We're lucky in that we have a paper conservator on our staff. We have a conservation workshop so that we can physically look after the materials we house. They're housed in purpose-built strong room areas which have state-of-the-art fire detection and fire suppression systems. We actually have a gas fire suppression system in all of our strong room areas which will put out the fire without damaging the documents. We're told that it will also do it without killing the people, but expensive to test it. And of course, our mission is a twofold one, simple twofold one. It's to preserve the material in our care so that it's here not just for this generation, but for generations to come. But it's also about making it accessible and available. There is no point holding this material unless people can come in and use it. The Archive Centre isn't an ivory tower locked away within the university. We're open Monday to Friday, 9 to 5. Anyone can make an appointment to come and see the papers here and to use the materials. But we're also, of course, looking at ways of opening up the archive. So with the Churchill papers, they've all been digitised. You can actually, all of you, access them freely while you're on site here in Churchill College through our website. But if you're at other universities and other institutions, we have a commercial arrangement with the publisher Bloomsbury. So these are the people who brought you Harry Potter. They've reinvested their Harry Potter money in Winston Churchill. They've helped us digitise the whole Churchill archive, and they sell that to other research libraries and universities to make it available there. So, and we're also making it freely available to any schools anywhere in the world that want to use it. With Margaret Thatcher's papers, we've digitised the collection, and as the collection opens up, we make a selection freely available through the website of the Margaret Thatcher Foundation. And of course, as the Archive Centre goes forward, we'll be looking to find ways to digitise more and more of our material. We're also quite keen to exhibit it. We lent material recently to the Churchill Scientists exhibition at the Science Museum. We cooperated with the Musée de l'Armée in Paris on a Churchill de Gaulle exhibition. I was convinced that at some point it would become a de Gaulle and Churchill exhibition, but amazingly it stayed that way round. Sorry about this, but we also had a major exhibition at the Morgan Library in New York, which was opened by Boris Johnson. The archives have now got a lot of recognition. We're an accredited repository under the National Archives scheme, and the Churchill Papers collection is now actually listed on the UNESCO International Register of the Memory of the World, which is sort of, for an archive, that's the equivalent of sort of UNESCO World Heritage status. And that's it, really. I thought I would have to end with a Churchill quote. And I think as we go forward, as we look at sort of digitising the material and trying to get it out there and make it more available, I think it is all about the empires of the future being the empires of the mind. Now, that is a lightning overview both of Churchill and of the Archive Centre. I'm sure I've missed out an enormous amount, but thank you very much for listening.